A German U-boat commander grips the edge of his chart table and tries to make the numbers behave. They won't. His patrol area is supposed to be a killing zone. The charts say it. The orders say it. The whole strategy of the U-boat war depends on it. But for the third time in the same month, the ocean in front of him is empty. Not quiet because they're hiding. Not quiet because he missed them. Empty like someone erased the targets before he even arrived. That's the part that rattles him. Not the cold, not the depth charges, not the fear of dying in the dark. It's the feeling that the enemy is moving first, like the convoys know where he'll be, before he does. Like his patrol grid was never a secret at all. If you've ever played poker with someone who always seems to know your hand, you know the vibe. It's not just losing. It's losing in a way that makes reality feel rigged, and that's what was happening in the Atlantic. Not because the British had magic radar, not because the Germans had traitors everywhere, not because of some lucky capture that changed everything in a single heroic moment. It was worse for Germany than that, because Britain wasn't cracking one code. Britain was reading an entire war. Before we go any further, quick favor. If you like the WWII stories that movies usually skip, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next part. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth. Hollywood rarely tells straight. Most people hear code breaking and think Enigma. One machine, one puzzle, one genius, roll credits. But Britain's real achievement wasn't just breaking Enigma. It was building a factory system for breaking German communications across the board. Army, Air Force, Navy, and more. Then turning that raw information into battlefield decisions without tipping off the Germans that anything was compromised. That second part is the part that doesn't fit a movie, because it's not one dramatic aha moment. It's organization, repetition, discipline, procedures, secrecy, endless shifts, people doing the same demanding work until the machine of intelligence becomes faster than the enemy's ability to move. And at the center of that machine was a place that looked nothing like a fortress. It was an estate in the English countryside turned into a high-speed brain. Bletchley Park. If you picture one lonely mathematician scribbling equations by candlelight, throw that image out. Bletchley was a massive operation. By the peak of the war, thousands of people were working there. Mathematicians and linguists, yes, but also clerks, radio intercept operators, analysts, engineers, and a whole lot of staff doing detailed, repetitive work that had to be right every time. It wasn't a lone wolf story. It was a team sport scaled up to industrial size, and the enemy they were trying to beat wasn't simple. The Enigma machine wasn't a code in the way most people mean it. It was a system that scrambled letters through internal wiring and rotating parts, producing mind-bending numbers of possible settings. The Germans treated it like a lock with so many combinations that no one could try them all. Even worse, the problem reset constantly. Settings changed day after day. And different branches used different keys and procedures. You weren't trying to crack one safe. You were trying to crack a safe that changed its combination overnight while the war kept moving. This is why the Germans believed they were safe. Not because they were arrogant, because the math looked unbeatable. So how did Britain beat it? Not with a single genius solves the puzzle moment. With scale. Bletchley Park broke the job into pieces. Interception, sorting, cryptanalysis, translation, evaluation, and then, most important, delivery to commanders in a way they could use. Because there's a dirty secret about intelligence. Reading the enemy is only half the battle. If you can't move that information to the right person at the right time, it's useless. And if you move it in a way that reveals you're reading the enemy, you've just burned the greatest advantage in the war. Britain's solution was something known as Ultra. Ultra wasn't just top secret. It was treated as a special category, information so sensitive that even many senior officers weren't told where it truly came from. Instead, Britain used controlled channels and liaison officers to pass along what mattered, often dressed up as if it came from normal sources like reconnaissance, prisoner interrogations, or routine patrol reports. To the commander receiving it, it might look like a good tip. To Britain, it was the enemy's own message, sometimes read within hours. That system did two things at once. It let commanders act on the information. It protected the secret of where the information came from, because Britain wasn't trying to win one battle. They were trying to keep Germany talking, on compromised systems for as long as possible. And that meant restraint. Sometimes, even when Britain knew something terrible was coming, acting too obviously could be worse in the long run. If Germany figured out the truth and changed procedures the right way, the whole ultra advantage could collapse. That's a brutal trade-off, and it's part of what makes this story so intense. Intelligence isn't just clever, it's cold. Now, let's address the title head-on. Britain broke every German code. That statement gets people fired up, and it should come with careful wording. Germany used multiple cipher systems and procedures, not one. Enigma is the famous one, but there were higher-level systems for very high command traffic. And there were also countless formats, codebooks, and signal methods across different branches. Britain's signals intelligence and code-breaking effort targeted the whole ecosystem. The result, especially as the system matured, was that German military communications were compromised far more broadly than most people realize, which leads to the next uncomfortable truth. A lot of what the Allies did in WWII looks lucky in hindsight. Convoys randomly avoid wolfpacks. Strikes hit supplies at the perfect time. Deceptions land, and the enemy takes the bait. Generals seem to have a sixth sense. When you insert ultra into the picture, that luck starts to look like information. And it explains why German leaders after the war often sounded genuinely confused about how the Allies kept showing up in the right place. Because from the German side, the war often felt like this. They planned, they moved, they issued orders, they transmitted instructions, they used machines they believed were unbreakable, and the enemy still seemed one step ahead. Imagine living in that world. You change procedures, you update keys, you tighten discipline, and it still happens. At some point, you stop thinking, we're unlucky, and start thinking, this is impossible. That's where we're going next, because the Atlantic wasn't an abstract chessboard. It was steel and salt water, men trapped inside pressure hulls, merchant ships burning at night, escort crews running on exhaustion, and families waiting for ships that never came home. And in that nightmare, small differences in information weren't nice to have. They were life and death. So here's the question that should be sitting in your mind right now. If Britain had a pipeline into German signals, if Ultra was feeding commanders real usable enemy information, what did that change on the map? What did it change in the Atlantic convoys, where U-boats hunted in coordinated groups? What did it change in the desert, where fuel and supply decided everything? And what did it change when the biggest invasion in history was about to hit the beaches of France? Because once you understand how the intelligence worked, the war starts to look different. Not easier, not clean, just explained. Start with the Atlantic, because that's where the pattern became impossible to ignore. Germany's U-boat campaign wasn't random chaos. It was a system. U-boats didn't just wander around hoping to bump into a convoy. They operated like a net, spread out across expected routes, listening and watching. When one boat spotted a convoy, it sent a message, often to headquarters, so other boats could be directed in for a coordinated strike. That coordinated strike is what people mean by wolfpack tactics. It's smart, it's efficient, and early in the war, it was terrifyingly effective. A convoy moving slowly across open water can't dodge forever. Escorts can only be in so many places at once. If a pack converges at night, the attackers have the advantage. On paper, it's a nightmare for the Allies. But then something starts happening that should not happen if Germany's communications are secure. Convoys begin to miss U-boats over and over, not by minutes, by whole grid squares, not once in a while, consistently. From the German side, it feels like this. You are ordered to patrol a specific box of ocean. You arrive, and the prey you were promised simply isn't there. Then new orders arrive, another box. Same result. At first, you blame chance. Then you blame weather. Then you blame your own command. Then you blame the crew of the boat that made the sighting report. Eventually, you start whispering the word every military fears: betrayal. Because what else explains it? Except the real explanation is colder and more humiliating. The British weren't guessing where the wolf packs were. They were reading the messages that put them there. This is where Ultra stops being a cool spy story and becomes an engine that changes the math of war. If you can read where U-boats are being directed, you don't need to fight every battle. You can avoid it. You can reroute a convoy by a few dozen miles. That doesn't sound like much on a map, but in the Atlantic, it can mean the difference between a quiet crossing and a floating graveyard. And it's not just about saving ships, it's about breaking the entire logic of the wolfpack. Because wolfpacks depend on contact reports, coordination, and timing. If the prey keeps slipping away, the pack wastes fuel, wastes torpedoes, wastes morale, and spends more time transmitting, giving the codebreakers even more to work with. It becomes a vicious cycle. Germany thinks it has a hunting system. Britain turns that system into a self-inflicted injury. Now, there's a huge catch, one that matters for understanding how disciplined this operation had to be. Britain could not react too perfectly. If convoys always dodged, if British escorts always showed up at exactly the right spot at exactly the right moment, Germany might suspect the truth. So British intelligence had to manage appearances. Sometimes they would let a convoy stay on course if rerouting would look too convenient. Sometimes they would use other cover stories, like claiming a sighting from patrol aircraft, so an action could be explained without mentioning code breaking. And sometimes, even when Ultra pointed to danger, Britain had to accept risk to protect the bigger advantage. That's the part most people don't want to hear, because we like war stories where the good guys get the information and then make the perfect move. Real intelligence work isn't like that. Real intelligence is a constant argument between what you know and what you can safely reveal by acting. If you act too boldly, you teach the enemy your secret exists. And if the enemy learns the secret exists, they change behavior, change procedures, tighten discipline, redesign systems, and suddenly your golden stream of information goes dry. So Britain treated Ultra like a fragile weapon, powerful but easy to ruin. That brings us to the moment that Hollywood loves to simplify, capturing Enigma material at sea. Movies often sell it as one daring mission, one dramatic boarding, and boom, code solved, war changed. The truth is more complicated and a lot more British. Persistence, repeated efforts, and very real risk to sailors who had to do something unbelievably dangerous. Boarding a damaged enemy submarine is not a clean action hero stunt. It's a nightmare. A submarine can sink at any moment. It can flood suddenly. It can have booby traps. It can still have crew inside fighting for their lives. It can be on fire. It can be full of toxic fumes. And yet, there were Royal Navy boarding parties who went in anyway because the prize wasn't gold or weapons. It was paper, code books, keys, settings lists, procedure instructions, anything that would help the codebreakers keep pace with changes in German naval signals. Because the naval problem was especially brutal, the German Navy had reasons to be strict, and they upgraded procedures when they believed it necessary. That meant the codebreakers needed every edge they could get to keep reading traffic fast enough for it to matter. This is where Britain's war at sea connects directly to Bletchley Park's war on symbols. When code material was captured, it didn't solve everything, but it could speed up the process and keep the system workable under pressure. And that difference, speed, was everything. A decrypted message that arrives too late is just trivia. A decrypted message that arrives in time is a convoy saved, a wolfpack avoided, a trap sprung, a warship redirected. So Britain built a pipeline. Intercept the signal, break it quickly, translate it, interpret what it actually means operationally, and then pass it to commanders in a way that doesn't reveal the source. That pipeline is what made Ultra devastating. Now, once you understand that pipeline, the Atlantic story turns into something like a chess match, where one player can see parts of the other player's plan. Not every move, not perfectly, not always in time, but often enough to tilt the odds. And in a war of tonnage, ships and cargo and fuel, tilting the odds is the same as changing history. But the Atlantic isn't the only place where this mattered, because Ultra didn't just help the Allies dodge danger. It helped them hit weak points. It helped them target logistics. It helped them understand what the Germans feared, what they prioritized, and where their resources were thin. And when you shift from the ocean to land, logistics becomes even more decisive, which brings us to North Africa. Think about the Desert War for a second. Tanks are useless without fuel. Armies are helpless without ammunition. Men can't fight without food and water. Every mile forward stretches supply lines longer and thinner. If you can disrupt supply in North Africa, you don't just slow an advance, you can stop it cold. And that's why the next phase of this story matters so much. When Ultra begins revealing schedules and movement details that allow the Allies to strike supply lines with precision that looks supernatural from the German side. Before we go there, though, you need to understand the emotional center of this whole operation. It's not the machines, it's the discipline. Thousands of people were involved in intercepting and processing information. Field commands received carefully packaged intelligence. Naval officers and air crews acted on it. Staff officers handled it. And the rule was simple: you don't talk about it. Not casually, not privately, not to your spouse, not even to people who had served right beside you. Because if the secret leaked, even once, Germany could tighten the system enough to shut the whole thing down. The Germans were not stupid. They were not helpless. They were just working from a wrong assumption that their communications were secure. As long as they held that assumption, Britain could keep winning the information war. And that's why there's a dark edge to this story. There were moments when Britain couldn't act, moments when doing the obvious thing would be too obvious, moments where the safe move militarily could be the risky move strategically, because it might reveal Ultra. When that happens, intelligence becomes a moral weight, not a power fantasy. And in the next part, that weight becomes impossible to ignore, because the story moves from ships in the Atlantic to war on land, to deception on a global scale, and to one of the most haunting examples of why Britain protected this secret at almost any cost. If the Atlantic showed what Ultra could do, North Africa proved what it could decide. Because in the desert, war isn't just about who has the better tank. It's about who can keep the tanks moving. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, water, tires, engine oil, radios, even basic medicine. Take any of those away, and the strongest armored force on Earth turns into metal parked in sand. By mid-1942, the situation looks grim for the British in North Africa. German and Italian forces are pushing east. The stakes are huge: Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the whole Allied position in the Mediterranean. And here's what makes that theater so brutal. Long supply lines over water. Supplies had to travel by sea, then across harsh terrain. If you disrupt shipping at the right time, the whole front line starts starving. Ultra begins feeding the Allies details that are not just "the Germans are coming." It's the kind of information that hits you in the stomach because it's so practical. Routes, timing, cargo types, movement schedules. Not perfect every time, not unlimited, but enough to create a pattern. The Allies start striking supply with a level of accuracy that feels impossible to the people being hit. Think about it from the German side. You send fuel and ammo toward the front, and Allied aircraft and ships seem to show up right where they need to be, not just in the general area, at the moments that matter. If you're commanding an army in the desert and your supplies keep getting shredded before they reach you, your options shrink fast. You can't improvise fuel. You can't willpower your tanks into moving. You either get the deliveries or your advance dies in place. And that's exactly why this story matters. Britain wasn't just learning German intentions. Britain was learning German lifelines. This is the kind of advantage that doesn't always look dramatic in a movie, because a bomb hitting a tanker at sea doesn't have the emotional punch of a firefight. But on the ground, the effect is brutal. A unit that should be attacking is suddenly stuck. A commander who thinks he has momentum discovers he's running on fumes. Plans collapse not because the enemy outshot you, but because the enemy removed your ability to function. That's intelligence warfare at its most ruthless. You don't have to beat the punch if you can cut the arm off at the shoulder. Now here's the catch again, because Ultra never comes without a price. Britain couldn't act on it like a person who knows the future. They had to make it look like normal wartime success. So they hid Ultra behind believable explanations: recon sightings, coastal patrol reports, routine intercept analysis, prisoner information, anything that could plausibly justify a strike, because the entire advantage depended on Germany staying confident in its security. And sometimes that confidence forced Britain into choices that still make people argue today. One of the most painful examples is the bombing of Coventry in November 1940. Here's the core problem, stripped of drama. If British leadership sees clear indications that a major raid is coming and suddenly evacuates a city or massively shifts defenses in an unusual way, Germany might realize its plans are being read. And if Germany realizes that, Germany changes the game. So British leadership faced a kind of nightmare logic: protect the secret and keep the long-term advantage, or act too clearly and risk losing the ability to read German communications going forward. Coventry was devastated. Hundreds were killed. The city center was badly damaged, and a historic cathedral became a symbol of what air war could do. This is not a feel-good part of the story. It is the part that proves Ultra wasn't a superhero power. It was a weapon that demanded discipline, sometimes a horrifying amount of discipline. Because from Britain's view, the worst outcome was not one city destroyed. The worst outcome was Germany changing procedures so effectively that Ultra goes dark, and the war drags on longer, with far more cities burned, far more ships sunk, and far more soldiers killed. That's the moral math. Not easy, not clean. Just the kind of calculation nations make when survival is on the line. And it brings us to the biggest stage of all, the invasion of Western Europe. D-Day is often told as a story of courage, landing craft, and chaos on the beaches. That's real, and it matters. But there's another side: deception, because the Allies needed Germany to look the wrong way. They needed German leadership to hold forces away from the actual landing area long enough for the beachhead to survive. So the Allies ran a massive deception plan, Operation Fortitude, designed to convince Germany that the main invasion would hit the Pas-de-Calais region, not Normandy. Fake units, fake radio traffic, dummy equipment, double agents feeding controlled information. A whole theatrical production built to shape what Germany believed. But here's the key. How do you know your deception is working? In most wars, you guess. You watch reactions. You interpret troop movements. You hope. With Ultra, Britain and the Allies could do something far more powerful. They could read German communications that revealed what the enemy leadership believed, not in some mind-reading way, just in the simplest, most brutal way possible. Germany wrote down its assumptions and messages, and Britain read them. That meant the Allies weren't just hoping Fortitude worked. They could see signs that German leadership was still fixated on Calais as the main threat. They could see that units were being held back, positioned for a second invasion that wasn't coming. And that matters, because in the first days after June 6, 1944, time was everything. If German armored divisions had slammed into the Normandy beachhead at full speed with the right concentration, the invasion could have been in real danger. Instead, German reactions were tangled up in confusion, hesitation, and competing assumptions, exactly what the deception aimed to create. Ultra did not win D-Day by itself. Nothing in war is that simple. But it contributed to a picture where the Allies could better understand what Germany expected, what Germany feared, and how Germany might respond. That information is priceless when you are betting everything on one narrow strip of coastline. Now step back and look at the pattern across these three areas: Atlantic, North Africa, and the run-up to D-Day. Ultra isn't a side story. It's a layer underneath the war, pushing outcomes in small ways that add up. A convoy avoids a wolfpack. A supply shipment gets hit at sea. A commander receives an innocent-looking tip that happens to be dead accurate. A deception plan is confirmed by enemy communications. And through it all, the same requirement never changes: don't let Germany realize what's happening. That's why this story stayed hidden for so long after the war. Because if the world learns exactly how you did it, how you organized it, how you distributed it, how you protected it, then future enemies can adapt. Britain's signals intelligence tradition didn't end in 1945. It rolled forward into the Cold War, which is why the secrecy lasted decades. And that long secrecy creates the next twist in this story, one that hits Americans right in the pop culture. Because while Britain was keeping quiet, movies were being made, stories were being simplified, credit was being reassigned, not always maliciously, often just because a clean, heroic narrative sells better than a complicated truth. So in part 4, we're going to talk about the Hollywood version that convinced a generation that America captured the Enigma breakthrough, plus the even bigger piece most people miss: Britain's work against Germany's highest-level cipher, and the early computer built to crack it, because Enigma wasn't the peak. It was the floor. Now we get to the part that makes the title sting. Why so many Americans grew up believing the big code-breaking win was basically an American story. Because if your WWII knowledge comes mostly from movies, you've probably absorbed a simple narrative. A brave team risks everything, captures an Enigma machine, and the Allies suddenly start reading German messages. It's tidy, it's dramatic, it's also wildly misleading. Hollywood didn't just compress the story. In one of the most infamous cases, it reassigned it. The movie people always point to is U-571. The plot sells a true story vibe. American submariners board a German U-boat, seize Enigma materials, and help crack the code. Here's the problem. The specific scenario presented is not what happened. The real U-571 was not boarded by Americans in that way. It was later sunk in 1944, and it was not the magic capture that unlocked Enigma. So what actually happened in the kind of operations Hollywood is trying to borrow? British naval forces carried out dangerous captures of German cipher material earlier in the war, actions that fed into the larger Ultra pipeline by helping code breakers keep pace, especially with naval traffic. One early example often discussed is May 1941, when HMS Bulldog forced a German U-boat to the surface, and a British boarding party recovered Enigma material before the boat went down. And there were other actions too, some of them involving men going into sinking submarines for documents that were literally underwater. That's not an action scene you can clean up for a movie without stripping away what made it real. It's claustrophobic, it's chaotic, it's terrifying, and it can turn fatal in seconds. In at least one case in the Mediterranean in 1942, British sailors entered a flooding U-boat to grab codebooks, an act of courage that cost lives. They were passing material up through a hatch, even as the sub sank. That's not an easy story to package as a feel-good adventure, but it's an honest one. So why didn't Britain just fight for the credit right away? Because the greatest accomplishment wasn't a capture. The accomplishment was the system, and the system stayed secret. Ultra remained classified for decades after 1945. Not months, not a couple years, decades. That decision reshaped history in a weird way. While Britain was silent, the public story of WWII was being written in real time by books, newspapers, documentaries, and especially by film. And film loves a certain kind of hero story. One bold mission, one dramatic breakthrough, one clear protagonist. The real Ultra story doesn't behave like that. It's thousands of people working in shifts, processing raw signals, building procedures, and staying quiet as the war rages outside. It's closer to an industrial operation than a swashbuckling raid. So the simplified version won, not necessarily because America stole it on purpose, but because the market rewarded a story that centered American characters doing a single heroic act. And because Britain, by policy, couldn't publicly correct the record without exposing the real scope of its signals intelligence capabilities. That silence didn't just protect WWII secrets, it protected a post-war future. Britain's signals intelligence didn't stop in 1945. It evolved, partnerships formed, methods carried forward, and keeping details under wraps mattered in the Cold War, when encryption and interception were still central to national survival. So Britain made a strategic choice, ongoing advantage over public recognition. That's the moment where this story becomes very British in tone. Quiet power beats loud credit. But here's where it gets even bigger, and this is the piece Hollywood almost never explains correctly. Enigma was not the highest-level German cipher problem Britain tackled. Enigma was famous because it was widespread and because it affected so much of the war. But Germany also used a more complex system for very high-level communications, especially traffic between top command levels. This cipher system is often associated with the Lorenz machine, used for long-range communications. Compared to Enigma, it was a different beast, more complex, with an output that demanded a different approach. And to attack that problem, Britain did something that should be treated as one of the turning points of modern history. They built a machine to process it at unprecedented speed. That machine was Colossus. Colossus was designed by Tommy Flowers, an engineer who came out of Britain's telecommunications world, and Colossus is widely recognized as an early programmable electronic digital computer. Not a laptop, obviously, not general-purpose computing in the modern sense, but a working electronic digital machine that could be programmed to run different logical operations for code breaking. And here's why that matters for your everyday life in 2026. This wasn't a side project for science fairs. This was the ancestor of the digital world. Britain didn't just crack codes. Britain pushed computing forward because it had to, because war forced a level of urgency that academia and peacetime budgets rarely create. Multiple Colossus machines operated by the end of the war, chewing through intercepted material at speeds that were extraordinary for the era. But then comes the most frustrating part. Britain basically erased its own achievement from public view. After the war, under secrecy rules, the project remained classified. Machines were dismantled, documentation was restricted, people who worked on it were bound to silence. So while the story stayed hidden, another public story became dominant. The idea that America invented the computer first, with machines like ENIAC getting the spotlight. To be clear, American wartime computing was real and important. But the point here isn't to dunk on the United States. The point is that Britain's work, especially Colossus, was buried for decades, and that shaped public understanding of both WW and computing history. Meanwhile, the human cost stayed buried too, because Bletchley Park wasn't a club of a few professors. It was an enormous staff effort. Many workers were civilians, many were young, many were women. A huge portion of the operation involved people doing demanding work without fully being told what the output would ultimately change, because compartmentalization was part of security. And after the war, many of them went right back into normal life. Jobs, families, quiet retirement. They watched movies that got it wrong. They heard the war explained in ways that blurred their contribution into the background. And they couldn't correct the record, because the rules that kept Ultra alive during the war kept them silent afterward. This is why the myth of the lone genius is so incomplete. Yes, there were brilliant minds involved, Alan Turing being the most famous name today. Turing's contributions were profound. Theoretical foundations, practical methods, major impact on the naval problem, and ideas that helped shape the future of computing. But even that part of the story is often told in a way that misses the larger reality. Turing was part of a vast machine of people and process. And, after the war, Britain treated him terribly. He was prosecuted for a homosexual relationship, subjected to chemical treatment, lost clearance, and died young. It's one of the ugliest examples of a society benefiting from someone's genius, then punishing him for who he was. So when people say, "Why didn't Britain claim the story louder?" you can see the pattern: secrecy, institutional priorities, a culture that valued quiet service, and a post-war government that chose intelligence advantage over public celebration. Eventually, decades later, the truth began to emerge through declassification and historical work. And historians had to revisit battles that once looked like narrow wins or lucky breaks and recognize an invisible hand guiding events. Not fate, not magic, signals intelligence, the ability to intercept, decrypt, analyze, and distribute enemy communications at scale, without revealing that you could. And that is the real takeaway that should stick with you longer than any movie scene. Britain didn't just break Enigma. Britain built a disciplined intelligence ecosystem, people, machines, procedures, and distribution that let the Allies act on German communications across the war. It shortened the conflict, saved countless lives, and helped decide campaigns. And because it stayed secret for decades, the public story drifted into a simpler, more marketable shape, one where the credit often went to the country making the movies. If you're American and you feel a little annoyed by that, that's fair, but don't aim that frustration at the veterans who served. Aim it at the storytelling machine that prefers clean heroes over messy truth, because the real story is better than the myth. It's bigger, stranger, and more human. A nation under threat built an intelligence factory, invented key parts of the digital age under pressure, and stayed silent long enough for the world to forget who did what. So here's the full picture. Without the Hollywood filter, Britain and its allies intercepted German signals, broke major cipher systems, turned that into actionable intelligence through Ultra, and protected the secret with a level of discipline that sometimes demanded terrible restraint. They helped steer convoys, disrupt supplies, validate deception, and shape decisions at the highest levels. And for decades, many of the people who made it happen couldn't even tell their own families. The least we can do now is remember it accurately. And if you want more WWII stories where the real record is wilder than the movie version, stick with this channel.